So this is what we are going to achieve in this video. We're going to create a couple of buttons with different states. For instance, a hover state where we hover over a button, we change the cursor and the background color, and also an active state where we press it down to the floor and we interact with it. And also a disabled state. So if the button can't be clicked, we're going to have it grayed out. And also in general, just allow the CSS and best practices and how to create buttons which are repurposable with classes and generally an okay structure of CSS. So let's just get started. Okay, so here we have a pretty standard HTML structure, and we are going to go into the main element and insert our button. And because we are using a button element, we can be pretty broad in the class name, because we can select it based on the element which holds the class. So if we go up to the head and insert a style tag, because we're going to use internal style sheets for this example, we can select the button element which holds a class of download. And in here we can just start off with background color, set it to green. And in the button we're going to insert some text, download. So as we insert more buttons into the HTML, we give it different names like cancel. And then we give that class, or that we create a selector which select that specific element. So button which has a class name of cancel. So there's a couple of things we want to keep in mind when designing our buttons, and it's for one, it's conveying the intention or the functionality of the button, and also you want to motivate the use of different buttons. So in the CSS, we can now do a pretty broad definition and just select all the button elements. So it doesn't matter if it has a class or not. We're just gonna target the button element, and we can use a cursor and set it pointer. So when we hover over a button in the HTML, we get this pointer right there. Of course, this only works on desktop PCs or units with a mouse cursor on it, and you can't see this effect on the touch interfaces. So on touch interfaces, we need to compensate for this lack of visual cue. Now that we have this broad button selector that selects all the buttons in our HTML, we can use this selector to give all the buttons a certain shared style. So for instance, padding. We want a shared padding on all the buttons. Maybe we want some to be bigger, or maybe some smaller, but in those cases we can go into the more specific selectors and overwrite the padding in those classes. But for now, having like a padding defined for the general buttons in our page would mean that we write less code. So now we can look at pseudo classes, and with pseudo classes we can assign different styling based on the pseudo class we are using. So by addressing pseudo classes, we just insert a semicolon, and we have some, for instance, hover. So if we hover over a button which has a download class, we can change the styling. So let's set this to yellow, and if we try to hover over the download button, this turns yellow. We can also make this more fancy by inserting a transition property on the button class, and the button selector. And we are setting it up here because we want this behavior to be applied to all the buttons elements. So here we can say background color. We want to add a transition to the background color property of the buttons, and we want this transition to take 2 seconds. So 0.2 seconds. And now when we hover over the button, we get a transition of 0.2 seconds, where it transitions from the default color green to the hover state where it has a background color yellow. So now that we have the basic selectors, we can just expand this further and go into make it a bit prettier, for instance. So A1, F1, C1, get a really bright green. On the hover state, we're gonna make it a bit brighter. So we make this B and FF and D. So when we hover over, it becomes a bit brighter. And then there's another pseudo class which is active. So that is when when we are pressing the button, we give it another style. So we can make that a bit darker. F1, E1, and B1. Maybe a bit darker than this, but that's fine. So now we want to focus a bit more on the basic layout of the page, or how the buttons will fit into the page. So now we want to insert some content around the elements, so we can see how it manipulates the content above and below. Like so. So if this starts messing up the layout, we can now see it, how it moves the bottom content, for instance. Alright, so pretty common to remove the borders and insert a border border bottom, for instance, 2 pixels, a solid, and has a dark gray color, and also a border radius. So this gives the illusion of having like a shadow on the button, and it follows the border quite nicely, so it looks like a natural shadow. So it's pretty common to remove the border at the bottom here when you click the element. So we have this active pseudo class already on the download button, so we can just go here and say if we click the button we want the border to be none. So then the border disappears as we click it. And we also want it to kind of move downwards, so we have this transform translate coordinate in the y-axis. And because the border property on the button selector is 2 pixels, we can move this down 2 pixels. And the transform translate property is by default set to the center anchor of the element, so it's from here. So now when we click the button, it moves the element down 2 pixels. And we set it because the border bottom was 2 pixels high, we want it to translate the same amount downwards. Okay, so I'm gonna do one thing now. We're gonna remove the cancel button because I want to demonstrate something, how this behavior can mess up the structure below. If I remove the cancel and I click this, you can see it affects the content below here. Because we are removing the border, we are changing the box model of this element, so we are making it smaller. And that causes the content below to move upwards. And we can counter this by inserting a margin bottom as well, just adjusting the box model and adjusting the margin property and inserting a 2 pixel border at the bottom, or sorry, a 2 pixel margin at the bottom. When this counteracts the border that disappears essentially, because the transform doesn't really affect the layout or the position in the layout the button has, but the moving border does. So if I change this to 12, it doesn't affect the content below. So by inserting a margin bottom, we fix this problem. But the reason this didn't affect the layout earlier was because these buttons are inline, cancel. So even when we remove the margin or the border on this element, which is inline, still had the same dimensions. So to the content below, the content above was still the same height. So yeah, and also now we have put this behavior on the download button specifically, so we can move this actually to the to a button active selector. So active. So when a button is active, we want this behavior here to take place. Now it affects both the buttons. So now we have a hover state, an active state, and we also want a disable state. And usually it's common when writing JavaScript to just pass a disabled attribute to an element to disable it. And that has some standard aesthetics, but we are kind of overriding those with our own CSS, so we only have the font color passing through. But we can also write our own disable state, just like the active. So we address the button element, because that's where we are passing the disabled attribute to. And we can, because we are passing the color to the download class, we need to adjust the same download class, because if we do it just at the button, like so, the definition for the color, background color, comes at a later state in the download class, so it will be overwritten anyways by the color of the download class. So we need to make sure we go find the button element and look to the download class, and then wait, that's wrong. It has to be like this. So the button is disabled, and adjust the download class on that element. So here we can say if the button is disabled and it holds a download class, we want the background color to be gray and the color of the font to be something lighter or darker. That's up to you. We can say make it darker as well. And now we got to do the same thing for our hover state. So if we have the button and we have the download class, right? So the button is disabled and it holds a download, and we hover over this download class. We want a background color of gray. So because we now have a state where we are finding an element which is disabled and has a download class, and we are hovering this element, then we are overriding the hover over here. So now we have like a gray state also for the hover state when the button is disabled. And here's some food for thought. We could just make a new class and pass the class to the button element. But there is a bit more work in the JavaScript code to pass the disabled state and also pass the new class to the element. You can do both, but we can do this once in the CSS to set up the way that you just have to pass a disabled state and everything is fixed for them, or we can put in more work later and pass a class to every button that is going to be disabled. It's just more code, and in my opinion, it's worth it to write a bit more cumbersome CSS in the beginning and just once, and make less JavaScript code afterwards. So now we gotta do the same thing for the cancel button, but there is some syntax we can use to make the disabled state for the buttons easier. Because you want the same appearance for the disabled button, we can either write our own, write a new selector for the cancel, like so. But then we have two places in the CSS where we are setting the appearance of a disabled button, and if we are changing the appearance of one disabled button in the future, and it doesn't apply to another, it might be confusing. So it's better to define both these buttons with the same CSS properties. But we can do this by using a comma, and again stating if the button is disabled, and it has a. But now we write if it has a cancel class. So now this line of CSS, or this selector, select both the button disabled with a download class and a button disabled with a cancel class, and it gives it the same CSS properties. But for the other states, with the hover state, we want the cancel to have a different color on the hover state, so we need to give that a separate CSS selector. So we can just go below the cancel button and write we want the cancel hover, so I'll give it a hover state, and also a disabled hover state. But in fact, we want the same disabled or hover disabled state on the cancel button as we have on the download button. So we can also do the same principle as we did up here. We just insert a comma and include the cancel button as well in this line. So let me write, basically take this line, paste it up here. And now that button should also have the same hover state. So we only need the cancel hover and also the active. And where's the there's the active state for the download. You gotta do have the same thing here. So button.cancel active, and give these color values. I'm gonna skip ahead a bit and fill that in myself. So I forgot one thing. As we are hovering over the disable buttons, we still get the pointer cursor, and we need to remove that as we are hovering over disable buttons. And we have a selector here which does it for us. So as we hover over a disable button, either if it's a download or cancel button, we just want to make a default cursor. So we just write cursor in here and default. And now as we hover over a cancel button, which is or cancel or download button, which is disabled, we don't get that pointer anymore. So now I have put in the colors myself here and also removed the disabled attributes from the elements. And to me, these are what I would refer to as level 1 buttons. The text inside conveys explicitly the functionality of the buttons, download or cancel, and they are also color coded. And also they convey interactivity. As you hover over with the mouse, you get a different cursor and the button becomes brighter. And also when you press it, it goes down to the floor, which should convey that you're now interacting with the button and using it. So to me, this fulfills what I would refer to as a level 1 button. And a level 2 button would be a bit more complicated in code because you want a icon on it and maybe a gradient in the background, and that is what I will go through in the next video. So one unfortunate thing about linear gradients is that they are not animatable, so we can't have an effect where, for instance, hover over the button here and the gradient kind of opens up or changes the appearance. You can't animate it. So that's unfortunate, and some people get around this by using overlays over the buttons, and it complicates the code a little bit. But we can look at that example now, and you can determine yourself if it's worth it.